She thought her money could buy distance from people she despised. But on flight 328, Karma boarded with a boarding pass, and it had no intention of sitting quietly. Margaret Swanson reached the gate early, as she always did. She believed punctuality was the hallmark of civility, something she assumed most people had forgotten. The gate area was crowded with a mix of travelers, families wrangling children, tired business people with laptops glowing on their knees, and the inevitable casual flyers who wore flip-flops to the airport as if they were heading to a beach. Instead of 30,000 feet in the air, she sat in the first row of the waiting area, crossing one leg over the other with practiced elegance. Her handbag took the seat next to her, not because it was large, but because it was hers. No one ever dared to ask her to move it. A gate attendant walked by and greeted her with a polite, "Good morning." Margaret replied with a stiff nod. She didn't believe in casual friendliness from people paid to serve. From the corner of her eye, she spotted them, the couple she'd brushed past at security. The black couple. The woman with wild hair and the man with the smug smile of someone who thought they belonged in her world. Margaret narrowed her eyes. She watched as they approached the gate, found a pair of empty seats a few rows back, and settled in. The woman pulled out a book. The man leaned in and said something that made her laugh softly. Margaret frowned. Why did that bother her so much? She shifted in her seat and pulled out her phone, opening her Delta Airlines app. As her eyes scanned the seating chart, her heart stopped. Row 3A, 3B, and 3C. She tapped again, didn't change. Her seat 3A was next to them. Margaret stared at the glowing screen, her hand trembling just slightly. It had to be a mistake. First class was supposed to be better than this. It was supposed to be protected from this. She marched straight to the gate counter, heels clicking like gunshots on the tile. "Excuse me?" she said to the young woman behind the counter, whose name tag read Jessie. "I need to speak with someone in charge." Jessie looked up instantly on alert. "Yes, ma'am. What can I help you with? I need to change my seat. Immediately." Margaret said, "I was assigned 3A, and I just noticed. I'm sitting beside them." She gestured vaguely toward Ellis and Derek. Her voice dipped in a conspiratorial hush. Jessie blinked. "I'm sorry, what's the issue with your assigned seat?" Margaret leaned in slightly, lips pursed. "Look, I paid for peace, for privacy. I don't mean to make a fuss, but I'd prefer not to be seated next to them." Jessie followed her gaze and then paused. Her expression didn't change, but her posture straightened. "I'm afraid the flight is fully booked." "Ma'am," she said gently but firmly, "there aren't any available seats to switch." Margaret gave a short, bitter laugh. "That can't be right. Check again. I've been flying with Delta for 20 years. I'm Diamond Medallion." "I understand," Jessie said, keeping her tone professional. "But all first class and main cabin seats are currently taken." Margaret's voice grew sharper. "You mean to tell me that there's nothing, absolutely nothing, you can do?" Jessie offered a polite but resolute smile. "Not unless another passenger volunteers to switch. I can ask if you'd like." Margaret's eyes darkened. "No, I don't want to cause a scene." She turned sharply and stalked back to her seat, though her presence had already caused enough of a ripple that several passengers were now looking. Up from their phones, Ellis and Derek noticed the tension, but said nothing. Derek leaned close. "Do you feel that?" He whispered. Ellis didn't look up from her book, The Storm Gathering. "I feel it. Want to bet it's about us?" Ellis finally smiled and turned a page. "Doesn't need to be. We've been through worse." As boarding began, Margaret was one of the first to stand. She always boarded early, always took her time placing her bag in the overhead bin, and always sat down with the regal poise of a woman who believed she belonged where others did not. She took her seat in 3A. The black couple arrived seconds later. Derek helped Ellis stow her bag. Then he took the middle seat. 3B, Ellis sat in the aisle. 3C, and suddenly, Margaret was surrounded by the one thing she hated more than noise: difference. She could feel it creeping under her skin like a rash. She folded her arms, turned toward the window, and exhaled sharply. They were polite, too polite, in fact. It irritated her more than if they had been loud. She wanted them to mess up, to break some unwritten rule, to give her a reason, because then she could press the call button. Then she could complain. Then she could reclaim her comfort, her control. She waited, but Derek just smiled and offered her a quiet good morning. Margaret didn't respond. Ellis glanced at her but said nothing. She was already back in her book, and as the cabin door closed and the flight prepared for takeoff, Margaret realized something chilling. She was trapped at 30,000 feet, with the very people she'd spent her life looking down on. And this time, for the first time, no one seemed to care what she thought about it. The plane rolled slowly onto the tarmac. The cabin lights dimmed, passengers buckled in, and the soothing voice of Captain Lena Garcia came through the speaker. "Good morning, folks. This is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Delta Flight 328, non-stop service from New York to Los Angeles. We're currently number 3 for takeoff. Should be in the air in about 10 minutes. Flight time is just under 6 hours. Weather looks smooth. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride." The cabin settled into a hum of anticipation. But for Margaret Swanson, there was nothing relaxing about this ride. She sat stiffly in her seat, arms folded, eyes trained on the emergency procedures card. In front of her, like it might explain why the universe had betrayed her, she didn't acknowledge Derek beside her, nor Ellis, who was now highlighting a line in her novel. Margaret kept glancing at the couple from the corner of her eye. They were quiet, calm, completely unburied. It was infuriating. She cleared her throat. Loudly, no reaction. She shifted in her seat aggressively, still nothing. Then Derek reached up and adjusted the air nozzle above them, the motion brushing slightly near Margaret's side. That was enough. She pressed the flight attendant button. A soft chime rang out. A light blinked overhead. Within seconds, Raymond, the senior flight attendant, appeared. Mid-30s, warm smile, confident posture. He leaned in slightly. "Yes, ma'am. Is everything all right?" Margaret glanced at Derek, then back to Raymond. "I'd like to be reseated," she said. Raymond blinked. "I'm sorry. I don't feel safe," she said, enunciating the words with theatrical care. "I need to be moved." "May I ask what the issue is?" She lowered her voice. Just enough to be heard. "I'm surrounded. I'm uncomfortable. I didn't pay for this." Raymond's eyes flicked from her to Derek, who now looked up, puzzled but composed. Ellis had paused her reading. "I understand you're feeling uneasy," Raymond said calmly. "But there are no available seats left in first class. The cabin is full." Margaret gave a dry laugh. "That's what the girl at the gate said too. I told her the same thing I'm telling you. That's not acceptable. Find a solution." "I'm afraid the solution," Raymond said gently, "may be staying in the seat you were assigned." Margaret narrowed her eyes. "I don't think you understand who I am." Raymond's smile didn't fade. "You're a valued Delta passenger, ma'am, but all passengers are treated equally on board." That word "equally" hit her like an insult. She leaned back, scoffing audibly. "Unbelievable," Raymond gave her a polite nod and walked away, but not before offering Derek and Ellis a small, apologetic glance. Neither of them returned it. Derek inhaled slowly, jaw set. Ellis placed a hand on his arm. "Let it go," she whispered. "She's trying to make us the problem," he replied quietly. "She's playing victim so she can be the hero. Let her. You know who you are." Margaret shifted again, purposefully, pushing her elbow into Derek's side, just enough to cross the line, but not enough to be called out. Derek flinched, but said nothing. 5 minutes later, she did it again. This time, Derek turned slightly, made eye contact with her, and said, "Ma'am, I need you to respect my space." Margaret gasped, like she'd been accused of a crime. "Excuse me. You're pushing into me," Derek said, evenly. "Please stop." Raymond, who had been keeping a distant eye, stepped back over instantly. "Everything all right here?" "He just threatened me." Margaret burst out, pointing at Derek. "He's being aggressive." "This is exactly what I was afraid of." Passengers across the aisle began to look over. A man in row 4 took out his phone and tilted it slightly upward. Raymond held up a hand. "Sir, did Did you threaten this passenger? Derek spoke clearly. No, I asked her to respect my personal space. She's been elbowing me for the past 5 minutes, because he was leaning into my seat. I haven't moved. Raymond nodded slowly. All right, so I'll take a breath. Margaret wasn't having it. You need to move me now, she demanded. Or move them. Either way, I'm not sitting here for 6 hours being harassed. Raymond looked around. I'll speak to the lead supervisor. Please remain seated for now. Margaret crossed her arms again, furious. She had the look of a woman who believed the world was meant to adjust for her, and it wasn't adjusting fast enough. Captain Lena Garcia watched the small cabin alert light flash yellow. Twice. Seat 3A again. She sighed. Margaret Swanson, she muttered to herself. Third time this month? What's up? Her co-pilot asked. She's back. Same woman. Last time she refused to wear her mask and caused a delay out of Atlanta. Same seat, same attitude. Lena tapped her cum. Raymond, this is cockpit. Status? Raymond's voice came through calmly.
Passenger in 3A is escalating.
Discomfort with seat assignment. No threats, but the situation's building. Lena didn't hesitate. If she continues, we remove her. Before takeoff. I won't have this flight delayed by one entitled woman who thinks her seat comes with authority. Understood, Captain. Back in the cabin, Margaret watched Raymond walk down the aisle toward the cockpit. She believed that meant victory. What she didn't realize was that flight 328 had no tolerance left for her kind of storm. Margaret adjusted the pearl necklace around, her throat like it were armor, her symbol of status and self-righteousness. Her hands, though aged, bore the signs of pampered indulgence. Diamond. Rings, manicured nails, and clenched fists. She turned to Derek again. You should have offered to switch seats the moment you saw me coming. It's common courtesy. Derek, calm but tired, responded. Respect isn't given based on who sits. Down first? It's earned, ma'am. That infuriated her. I've flown this route every month since before you were born, she snapped. And never, never have I been made to feel so... invaded. Ellis finally closed her book. You feel invaded because we exist near. You, Margaret, gasped, offended. Don't twist my words. I didn't say that. No, Ellis said calmly. You didn't need to. More heads began to turn. Rows 2 through 5 now had multiple passengers watching. A man across the aisle raised an eyebrow. A woman behind leaned forward slightly. Earbuds still in, but no longer playing anything. Raymond returned. He bent down, lowered his voice but loud. Enough for Margaret to hear every syllable. Captain Garcia has been notified. We've documented your complaint. At this point, I'll need to ask one final time that you remain calm. Stop antagonizing other passengers and allow the flight to proceed without further disruption. Angeret's mouth twitched. Antagonizing me? I'm not the problem. They're the ones. Raymond didn't blink. This is your formal warning. Any further complaints, gestures, or attempts to provoke your seatmates will result in your removal from this aircraft. Derek and Ellis stayed quiet. Still calm, Margaret. Stunned, sputtered for a second before muttering, This is ridiculous. This is political correctness gone mad. She faced forward again, her eyes narrowed. Cheeks flushed a deep red, the kind that starts at the collarbone and creeps up. The body feels its status slipping. The plane taxied toward the runway. Flight. Attendants began their safety demonstration. Margaret didn't pay attention. She was crafting a mental speech, one she'd post online later. Wrongfully profiled, she'd write, made to feel unsafe. She would leave out the part about elbowing Derek, about calling them them. No one would believe them anyway. But then, quietly, a voice came from the row behind her, a woman. Older, firm-voiced, leaned into the aisle and said, You're lucky they're kind. If it were me you were treating like that, you wouldn't even be on this flight. Margaret twisted in her seat to look. The woman was black, silver hair pulled into braids, eyes sharp as glass. She wore a bright blue shawl and a knowing look. And, Who are you? Margaret shot back. Someone who's watched people like you poison the air for far too long. Margaret fumed. You don't even know me. But we know your type, the woman replied. And the thing about people like you get real loud when the system stops bending to you. A small ripple of tension moved through the cabin. No. Shouting, no fighting, just truth spoken in daylight. For the first time in years, Margaret Swanson felt something unfamiliar in her chest. It wasn't guilt. It was irrelevant. Up front, Captain Lena Garcia was watching the situation unfold via the cabin camera monitor. Her jaw tightened. She's done, she said. Should we turn around? Asked her Kodash pilot. Lena shook her head. No need. We haven't taken off yet. She picked up the intercom and spoke 4 words. Cabin crew, hold boarding. Then to Raymond over the com. Please remove passenger in 3A. Confirm once complete. Raymond stepped forward with slow, steady steps. Ms. Swanson, he said, I need you to collect your belongings. She blinked. What, you're being removed from this flight? You can't be serious, she snapped. You're throwing me off. Raymond didn't flinch. Captain's orders. Your behavior has violated Delta's passenger conduct code. You were given multiple warnings. This is the final step. You're choosing them over me? She demanded. Raymond didn't answer. He simply opened the overhead bin, gently pulled out her luggage, set it at her feet. All around her, silence reigned. Some passengers had tears in their eyes. Others nodded subtly. A few phones were recording. Margaret's face turned ghost white. This is ... discrimination. This is reverse racism. She stood trembling with rage. Derek didn't move. Ellis didn't. Look at her. Margaret grabbed her bag, clutched it like a lifeline, and began her slow, ashamed march down the aisle. As she passed row 5, someone whispered, about time. As she reached row 7, a man clapped. Then another. And then like a ripple, the cabin erupted in soft, defiant applause. Not because she was gone, but because dignity stayed. Because kindness endured. Because justice, for once, didn't sit silently. In the corner, Margaret disappeared through the door. It hissed shut behind her. Raymond turned to row 3. He looked at Derek and Ellis. We're sorry you had to endure that. Derek gave a tired smile. It's not the first time. It probably won't be the last. But it's the first time someone did something about it, Ellis said. Raymond smiled back. Not on my watch. Not today. The aircraft door sealed with a firm hiss, and the jet bridge retracted. There was something symbolic in that, as if the world had just shut a door on the past, was finally ready to take off toward something cleaner. The silence in the cabin, after Margaret's removal, lingered for a moment, like the space she had occupied held a trace of coldness still evaporating into the recycled air. But then a breath passed a collective exhale. Shoulders dropped. Tension melted. Peace was palpable. Raymond stood at the front of the cabin, microphone in hand. Ladies and gentlemen, he said calmly, we appreciate your patience. We apologize for the delay and thank you for your understanding. We are now clear for takeoff. Number 1 applauded. Not yet, but the silence spoke of respect, solidarity, relief as the plane began its slow, crawling journey down the tarmac. Ellis looked over at Derek, her eyes filled with both emotion and exhaustion. You okay? She asked. He nodded. I'm good. You? I'm just glad it didn't go worse. He gave her a faint, sideways smile. The bar is really low, huh? I guess we're used to it. She glanced toward the window where the edge of the runway gleamed under the morning sun. It's sad, she added quietly, that sitting in our assigned seats is seen as a protest, that our presence is still too loud for some people. Derek took her hand. It's louder now, he said. But this time, it was heard. Meanwhile, up in row 4, a teenage girl tapped her mother's arm. Why did they take the lady off? She whispered her mother, a schoolteacher from Long Island, leaned in and answered gently, because she treated people badly, sweetheart. And today, the airline decided not to let that slide. The girl paused. Is that normal? Her mother? shook her head. No, but it should be. Behind them, the older woman with silver braids leaned back in her seat, her eyes briefly closed. There was no smile on her face, only a knowing calm. She had lived enough years to know that change was never sudden. It came in moments. Small ones, and sometimes it came at 30,000 feet in the cockpit. Captain Lena Garcia gave a slight nod as her headset lit up green. Cabin secured, Raymond's voice said. She pushed the throttle forward. The jet surged into motion, wind rushing past the fuselage, the engines roaring with the kind of strength only discipline brings. Lena had been flying for over a decade. That time, she'd dealt with turbulence, technical failures, sick passengers, emergency landings. But this was different. As the plane lifted off, Lena felt it wasn't just the aircraft that had gained altitude. It was the flight crew's principles. Too, she smiled quietly to herself. Not today, Margaret, she murmured. 10 minutes after takeoff, the cabin service began. It's the usual drinks, snacks, small talk. But everything felt different. The space in 3A, now vacant, was like a ghost seat. The absence of its former occupant made it sacred. Raymond returned with a tray. Would either of you like anything? He asked. Derek smiled. I'll take a water, thank you, Ellis said. Ginger ale, please. Raymond poured both. Two handled that situation with more grace than most would. I didn't have a choice, Ellis replied. You did, he said. You just made the better one. Crouched slightly to their level. Full transparency? The captain's had her eye on that passenger for a while. You weren't the first to experience that kind of behavior. You were just the first who didn't shrink. Ellis blinked. She's done this before? Raymond nodded. 3 different complaints in the last 6 months, but this time it went too far. She picked the wrong flight and the wrong couple to try and intimidate. Derek raised an eyebrow. Why wrong? Because you didn't fight dirty. You didn't give her what she wanted. He stood. You gave us a reason to do what we should have done long ago. He moved down the aisle, leaving Ellis and Derek alone again. Ellis leaned her head on Derek's shoulder. I keep waiting for the anger to come. It will, he said, but let it come soft. Don't let it eat you. She nodded. I think I'm just sad for her. She doesn't even realize she's the villain in her own life. Derek kissed the top of her head. That's the hardest part. Watching someone sink in their own poison. Back in the terminal, Margaret Swanson stood with arms folded outside the gate. Her designer handbag hung heavy on her shoulder. Her mouth was tight. Her eyes burned with a fury she couldn't unleash. Not here. She had been escorted off without handcuffs, politely, quietly, but the sting of public humiliation lingered like acid in her throat. She pulled out her phone, opened Facebook. Her fingers hovered over the post button. Unjustly removed from Delta Flight 328 after being harassed and accused by disruptive passengers. I am appalled by the state of this country. When did it become a crime to feel unsafe? She stared at the words. She wanted outrage. She wanted sympathy. But for the first time, she hesitated. Not because she doubted herself, but because somewhere, deep, very deep, she knew. The world had started turning without her, and it wouldn't turn back. The plane soared through the morning sky, slicing across layers of cloud, as if carving a clean break between the past and what could come next. Back. In seat 3A, now empty, there lingered more than a woman's scent or the faint impression of her body. There was a shadow of a lifetime of presence, shaped not in minutes or hours, but in decades of quiet entitlement, unchallenged superiority, and unchecked fear. And far below, in an airport cafe near gate B-17, Margaret Swanson sat alone. For the first time in years, she wasn't in control. The Sunday sun spilled warm light over white lace tablecloths, where lemonade pitchers sweated and gospel music hummed from a nearby radio. 10-year-old Margaret Swanson sat primly on the porch swing of her grandmother's house, her polished black shoes not quite touching the floor. Ladies don't slouch, Margaret, said her grandmother, Martha, as she poured sweet tea into a glass with delicate precision. And we don't stare at the help. Margaret looked down immediately, cheeks burning. Across the yard, Dolores, the black housekeeper, was hanging laundry. She's not the help, Margaret muttered. She's Dolores. Her grandmother's lips thinned. Don't. Confuse decency with equality, child? That's how the world loses its order. Margaret didn't understand what that meant, not fully. But she nodded, because disobedience in that house meant silence, cold withdrawal, a kind of punishment that made even summer feel like winter. At church, pews were polished, the sermons fiery. The Swansons sat in the front row every Sunday, heads high. Their legacy went back 5 generations. Landowners, bankers, benefactors of the town. No one ever called them racist. They were traditional, protective, proud, and Margaret learned early. You didn't need to shout to be dangerous. You just needed to whisper at the right tables. Years passed, Margaret grew, attended a private all-girls academy where diversity existed only in brochures. At 21, she married Walter Swanson, a man twice her age and 10 times as wealthy. He liked her ambition, and she liked his status. It was a silent agreement, written in champagne and sealed with pearl necklaces. They had no children, a quiet choice no one dared ask about. Instead, Margaret raised herself on a steady diet of luxury travel, charity galas, and country club conversations about those people and how things aren't like they used to be. Yet every now and then, a flicker, a cashier who wouldn't look her in the eye, a black nurse who didn't call her ma'am, a teacher who assigned her niece a book by Malcolm X. Each moment felt like a small betrayal of the world Margaret had been promised, a world where superiority was invisible, but ever-present, protected, guaranteed, until finally on flight 328, someone dared to say, "No more." Up in the sky, Derek leaned back in his seat. Eyes closed, Ellis watched him for a moment, then turned to her notebook. She scribbled thoughts, a habit she'd picked up in college. What happens when kindness isn't enough? What happens when you're calm, polite, patient, and still punished? What happens when being human isn't enough to make others see you as one? She stopped writing, looked ahead, and thought back. It was fall, and the red trees glowed like fire. Ellis had been walking across the quad when a white professor pulled her aside after class. "Ellis, can I be honest with you?" She nodded warily. "You're brilliant. Your writing is exceptional. But if I were you, I'd tone it down. Don't come across so, forceful, confident. In a white woman, it's called ambition. In you, it's called attitude." Ellis had gone home that night and cried. Not because she was hurt, because she knew he was right. She had lived her entire life sharpening herself into something more than acceptable. She had learned to speak with precision, to dress non-threatening, to keep her rage wrapped in velvet. And even then, she was too much. It wasn't fair, but it was true until she met Derek. He was a public speaker, raised in Atlanta. His mother had been a school counselor, his father a mechanic who quoted Baldwin. Derek didn't shrink. He didn't apologize for being intelligent. He didn't laugh when people made coded jokes. He stared. Ellis had once told him, "The world will come for you harder than it ever comes for me." He had replied, "Then it's a good thing I don't run." Back on Flight 328, the drink cart passed again. The air was calmer now. Warmth had returned. The man across the aisle, a Latino tech executive in his 40s, leaned over. "I just want to say," he said to Derek and Ellis, "that was handled with more grace than I've ever seen. Some of us ... grew up knowing how fast things could go wrong." Derek smiled politely. "Thank you." "You two shouldn't have had to go through that," the man said. Ellis met his eyes. "We know. But we did, and maybe someone on this flight learned something because of it." Further back in row 8, a college student posted a TikTok. "So this white lady tried to get a black couple kicked off the flight. Said she felt unsafe. The flight attendants weren't having it. Kicked her off instead. Whole plane clapped. Faith in humanity restored. Hashtag Flight 328, hashtag Karma in the sky." The post would go viral within hours. But Ellis and Derek wouldn't know. They didn't need applause. They just wanted to arrive in Los Angeles without having to prove their humanity mid-air. As Flight 328 cruised over the heartland, a calm hush settled over the cabin. The hum of the engines was almost soothing, a soft reminder of how far removed they were from the chaos on the ground. But though the plane soared high, its passengers were firmly tethered to everything they had just experienced, especially Derek and Ellis in the flight deck. Captain Lena Garcia removed her headset briefly and looked out into the clouds. Then down at the printout she'd received moments after takeoff, a brief incident summary compiled by the flight supervisor. Unruly passenger. Racially motivated complaint. Escalated. Passenger removed. Cabin stable. Crew supportive. It was clinical. Cold, but the moment hadn't been. She felt it in her bones. Raymond knocked lightly on the cockpit door before stepping in. They handled it better than most. Better than I would have at their age. How's the cabin now? Peaceful, but heavy. Like everyone's processing what they saw? Lena nodded. I want to speak to them before we land. They deserve that much. Raymond smiled. They deserve more than that, Captain, but it's a start. Row 3. Derek was half dozing when a soft voice woke him. Mr. James. Mr. James? It was Raymond again, softer now. The captain would like a word with you if you're up for it. Ellis exchanged a glance with Derek, then nodded. They followed Raymond quietly toward the cockpit, where Captain Garcia waited, her expression firm but kind. I wanted to thank you both, she said. Not just for how you handled what happened, but for the grace you showed all of us. Derek shook his head. We didn't do anything special. You did, Lena replied. You showed restraint when you didn't have to. You trusted us to do the right thing, and you allowed others on that plane to see something real. Ellis tilted her head. It shouldn't be revolutionary to exist peacefully. No, said the captain. But in a world that still clings to inherited fear, it is. And sometimes, that quiet strength, that's what tips the scale. She paused, then added, We've filed an official report. The passenger's account doesn't match the flight footage. There will be consequences. Ellis blinked. She's done this before, hasn't she? Captain Garcia hesitated, then nodded. 3 times? Same complaints? Same pattern? This time it caught up. They stood in silence a moment longer, then Derek asked, Why now? Why us? The captain smiled, just slightly. Because you stood your ground. Because the world was watching, and for once, someone didn't look away. By the time they returned to their seats, passengers who'd pretended to be busy were now subtly watching them with new eyes, not pitying. It's not patronizing, just ... aware. Ellis leaned her head against the window. Ow. We're not even at cruising. Altitude of change, she said softly. But maybe we're gaining feet. Derek wrapped his arm around her shoulder. We've taken off. That's something. Back in the terminal, Margaret's phone buzzed with a call from her sister. She declined it. The notifications were piling up: texts, missed calls, even a voicemail from her husband's law partner. She wanted to scream, to undo it, to twist the story into something more digestible for her social circle. But deep down, she knew. The internet was already miles ahead of her, just like that plane she had been kicked off, and this time, no one was giving her a parachute. Margaret's heels echoed sharply in the corridor as she walked toward the exit of the airport, her Louis Vuitton rolling suitcase clicking on the tile. Her shoulders were squared, back rigid, jaw clenched. The security personnel had already called her a car. A black sedan waited outside, its windows tinted like the ones on her past, polished and protective. She climbed in, slammed the door, and gave the driver an address in Beverly Hills. Then she pulled out her phone. The video was everywhere, clips from inside the plane. The moment she stood and pointed, the words she'd said, the part where security escorted her away, it had been recorded from at least 3 angles. Even now, she could hear her own voice, strained, sharp, indignant. I don't feel safe sitting next to them. That sentence, those exact words, it had become a lightning rod. Twitter threads dissected her tone. TikTok lip-synced it mockingly. Journalists used it in headlines. YouTubers paired it with explicable videos about microaggressions. And in comment sections across the internet, people were naming her what she had always feared most. A racist, no excuses, no hiding. Even her private social media was under siege. She texted her attorney, "We need to respond." The reply was short. "We advise silence. Everything you say now can and will be used against you." She scrolled further through public callouts, think pieces, even hashtags. #Flight328 hashtag, karma and first class hashtag privilege unmasked. But one post stood out. A selfie of Ellis. And Derek, smiling tiredly after landing, captioned, "We made it. Love still flies." No bitterness, no gloating, just quiet triumph, and that burned more than anything else. Margaret clenched her phone and whispered to herself, "They'll forget. They always do." But a flicker of doubt curled at the edges of her mind. What if this time they didn't? The wheels of Flight 328 touched down on the tarmac of Los Angeles International Airport with a firm bounce and a cloud of hot rubber smoke. The plane slowed, gliding toward its assigned gate. Seatbelt signs still lit, silence draped. The cabin the kind of quiet that follows storms, even invisible ones. Ellis opened her eyes. Her fingers were laced with Derek's. He squeezed once, then kissed her knuckles. They had barely spoken since their meeting with the captain. Not out of avoidance, out of reverence. They had won. But they also knew this wasn't the kind. A victory that came with balloons and banners. As the plane came to a full stop, people began to stir. Overhead bins clicked open, luggage shuffled. A woman in row 5 leaned over and said, "You too. Thank you for staying calm, for standing tall." Ellis nodded, offering a soft, "We didn't have a choice." "Maybe not," the woman said, "but that doesn't make it any less brave." A man in row 10 clapped once, then twice. Slow ripple of applause moved through the cabin. Quiet, respectful. Not a celebration, but recognition. A reckoning. The flight attendant, Raymond, met their gaze from the galley and gave a subtle nod of respect. Ellis and Derek stood, dignified, unshaken. Outside the terminal, a small cluster of reporters had gathered. Someone had leaked the passenger manifest. Ellis's name had surfaced not just because of the incident, but because of her recent viral essay on racial perception in corporate America.
Oh.
Some recognized her, some didn't. A camera lens locked on Derek. A microphone was raised. "Ms. Ellis, can you comment on the altercation that happened on Flight 328? Ellis froze, then stepped forward. "I won't comment on the passenger, but I will say this. For far too long, people like me and my husband have been asked to make ourselves small, to apologize for merely existing, for being seated, for breathing too loudly in first class. Today we said, not anymore." Another reporter asked, "Do you see this as a turning point?" Ellis looked at Derek, then back at the camera. "No, not yet, but maybe it's a crack in the door." She turned away, not to flee, but to rise. Hours later, the clip aired on national news, spread across social media. Pundits debated it. Panels dissected it. Airlines released vague statements about sensitivity training, but none of that changed the small, intimate moment Ellis shared later that night with Derek, sitting by the hotel window. Watching the lights of LA twinkle like distant promises. "Do you think she regrets it?" Ellis asked. Derek didn't have to ask who. "She regrets being caught," he said. "That's not the same as regret." Ellis exhaled slowly. "It never is." A long pause. Then Derek whispered, "But still, we're here." She nodded. "We're here." And that on this night was enough. By morning, Margaret's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. She hadn't slept. Her phone buzzed endlessly, each ping another punch. Articles, mentions, opinion pieces, memes. Her husband had flown back from New York early, not out of sympathy, but damage control. He stood in the kitchen, arms folded, watching her as she sat silently at the marble island. "We've lost 2 contracts overnight," he said. "Do you understand what this means?" She didn't respond. "They said your behavior reflects on the firm. They're asking if you'll step down from the board." Still she said nothing. He finally exploded. "Do you even care what you've done?" "To us, Margaret's eyes flicked up cold, sharp. Us. This wasn't a U.S. moment. You weren't there. You didn't hear how he looked at me. Her husband shook his head slowly. No, Margaret. Just don't like being looked at the same way you look at others. Across town, Ellis scrolled through hundreds of DMIs and emails and messages of support, stories of solidarity, but also stories of similar encounters. People thanking her, people hurting, people still flying through their own skies of tension. One message stood out. You don't know me, but I was in row 9. I didn't speak up. I should have. I'm sorry. Thank you for being brave for the rest of us. Ellis showed the message to Derek. He read it, sighed, then looked up double quotes. See, even silence has echoes. They were booked for interviews now. It's not just tabloid fluff, but real discussions, morning shows, podcasts. Made a spot on a round table for PBS. They didn't want fame, but the world had handed them a mic. The question was what to do with it. Derek leaned forward. Let's not waste this. Let's use it. Let's tell the story, not just what happened, but what's behind it. Ellis nodded. Tell the truth. Not the trauma. The truth. Meanwhile, the airline released a new statement. This one was longer, clearer. It named the issue. It condemned the behavior. It announced new procedures. Raymond read it while on a break at the crew lounge. He smiled faintly. One of the newer attendants, a young woman named Celine, asked, Is it real, though? Will they change? Raymond answered, I don't know. But this time, someone made them look. That's a start. Margaret sat by the pool later that day, watching the ripples reflect the sky. She still wore makeup, still wore her pearls, but she felt aged, smaller, not in size, in certainty. She picked up her phone, opened Twitter, and hovered over the post button. Typed, I'm sorry. Then deleted it. Typed : I was misunderstood. Deleted again. Finally, she shut the app. She had no words that could rebuild what had been exposed, no clever caption to smooth over the scorn, and deep down, she knew it wasn't about what she said anymore. It was about what she had shown. The world moved. Planes kept flying. But somewhere in the minds of thousands of strangers, Flight 328 lived on, not as a news item, but as a mirror. 3 days after Flight 328, the story was still climbing. Ellis sat in a quiet corner of a midtown studio. Lights angled perfectly to soften her features. Across from her sat Maya Shu, host of one of the top-rated evening news programs in the country. The interview would air in prime time, not because Ellis had demanded it, but because the nation had. Let's start at the beginning, Maya said. When did you first sense something was off? Ellis didn't flinch. Her voice was steady. When she looked at me like I was a mistake in the seating chart. The audience, watching from millions of living rooms, felt it. Did you expect the airline staff to support you? No, Ellis said, but I hoped. That's the thing about hope. It's the only thing we can afford to carry for free. Maya nodded. And when they did support you, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like justice delayed for me, and for everyone who never got that moment. Back in LA, Margaret watched the interview from the darkness of her home office. Her husband hadn't spoken to her since the board suspended her indefinitely. The firm was now reevaluating her role. The house felt colder. On screen, Ellis's words echoed. When you grow up learning to de-escalate someone else's hate before it explodes, you become very good at shrinking yourself in public. But I don't want my children, or anyone's, to learn that kind of survival. Margaret's throat tightened. For the first time, she rewound the clip and watched again. Meanwhile, Derek was meeting with a civil rights nonprofit who had reached out. He wasn't a lawyer or a speaker, but his voice had power now. They offered him a spot as a community engagement lead. We want you to help us teach people how to respond, how to record, how to support. You don't need to be perfect, just be real. Asterisk, he agreed. Not because he wanted spotlight, but because he couldn't stand the thought of silence winning. In schools across the country, students debated the incident. Teachers created lesson plans. Writers drafted op-eds. Parents had difficult dinner table conversations. Flight 3 to 8 wasn't just a plane anymore. It was a platform. And still, in the quiet space between media cycles and viral outrage, real change flickered. Raymond received a promotion. Captain Lena Garcia was asked to speak at an aviation leadership conference, her panel titled, "The Courage of Policy When Humanity Leads the Cabin." And in a bookstore in Brooklyn, a young black girl picked up a magazine with Ellis on the cover. She didn't read the headline. She just whispered to her mother, "She looks like me." In a world built on altitude and illusion, sometimes the most powerful turbulence comes not from weather, but from truth. The walls of Margaret's home felt narrower with each day. Conversations were clipped. Her husband worked late. Her children, both in college, had sent carefully worded texts full of distance. It wasn't just her reputation that had cracked. It was her identity. She had spent a lifetime building the idea of herself, accomplished, cultured, discerning. And yet, one moment of unveiled entitlement had pulled that scaffolding down in front of a watching world. She poured herself another glass of wine and walked into the sunroom. Outside, gardeners clipped the hedges. She could hear the hiss of the trimmer, mechanical and relentless. Her phone buzzed again. An email? "We regret to inform you your invitation to the Palm Springs Women's Conference has been rescinded." She didn't even open the attachment. At the same time, Ellis sat on a panel in Chicago. The event was called Visibility and Voice, hosted by a university's diversity coalition. The audience was packed. Students, faculty, community members. "We talk about progress like it's inevitable," Ellis said, voice calm but unflinching. "But the truth is, it's not gravity. It doesn't just pull us forward. Someone has to push. And sometimes, someone has to be pushed out so others can board the flight." The audience murmured in agreement. A young man in the back shouted, "Say it again." Ellis smiled faintly. She didn't repeat it. She didn't have to. Derek, meanwhile, was preparing to host his first town hall event in partnership with the nonprofit. It was a small community center in South Central. No cameras, no media, just real people in folding chairs holding paper. Cups of lukewarm coffee. He stepped up to the mic, nervous. "My name is Derek James. I didn't set out to make a statement. I just wanted to sit with my wife on a plane, and that... APPARENTLY was too much for some people." Laughter. Murmured sympathy. But we didn't stay quiet, and neither should any of you. He looked out at the crowd. Nurses, teachers, barber with scissors still in his apron. You don't have to go viral to matter. You just have to show up. For yourself. For someone else. And when the time comes, and it always comes, choose the seat that lets you stand. Behind closed doors, boardrooms whispered. At the airline's corporate office, legal advisors reviewed footage again. Training programs were being rewritten. But more than that, policies were finally including racial bias as a priority, not an afterthought, one executive said. "We can't afford another flight 3 to 8. But the head of corporate relations corrected him. "We can't afford to ignore another. Flight 328. Margaret stood in front of her bathroom mirror. Her pearls were gone. Her lipstick a lighter shade now. Her reflection looked unfamiliar. Not because it had changed, because it had been seen. A week after the incident, Lax hosted a closed-door symposium titled Confronting Discrimination in the Skies. It was invitation only. Pilots, airline executives, legal experts, and a small selection of high-profile passengers. Including Ellis and Derek, Margaret had not been invited. The terminal conference room was quiet, polished, and overly sterile. A sanitized space to discuss an unsanitary truth. Ellis sat at the head of one table. A badge with her name and the word advocate hung from her lanyard. "Today," the moderator began, "we're going to unpack a moment that's already had widespread media attention. But we're not here for damage control. We're here for future control." The moderator looked directly at Ellis. "Ms. James, would you share why you think Flight 328 became more than a headline?" Ellis folded her hands, her voice clear. and confident, cut through the room. Because it wasn't just about one woman and her prejudice. It was about how the rest of us responded to it. The pilot, the crew, the silence, the defiance, the camera, the consequences. Heads nodded, and because the sky, she continued, was never supposed to have a color-coded class system. Yet here we are. Someone in the back whispered, "Damn." Outside on the actual tarmac, Raymond stood near a grounded aircraft. He was off duty but had come to walk through the same cabin layout from Flight 3 to 8. Not for nostalgia. For clarity. He stood at seat for C, then glanced toward for A and for B, where Ellis and Derek had been. He remembered the look in Ellis's eyes, the restraint, the dignity, and then he walked to where Margaret had stood, mouth tight, face twisted into control, masked as concern. He exhaled slowly. "Never again," he muttered. "Not on my watch." Margaret, meanwhile, found herself at a community mediation center. Not for any court-mandated reason, but because her youngest daughter had begged her, "At least try, Mom, please." The center was small, quiet. It smelled faintly of incense and old carpet. She sat across from a therapist named Layla, who said, "We're not here to absolve. We're here to examine." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. "Fine," she said. "I don't think I'm a racist." Layla nodded. "Most people don't. But let's talk about impact, not intent." For once, Margaret didn't argue. She listened, and slowly, painfully, began the unlearning. Back at the symposium, Derek spoke next. Most people see the clip and think, "That was bold, standing up like that." But what you didn't see was the 10 seconds before I stood, the part where I asked myself if it was worth the risk. He looked out at the room. That risk, that hesitation, it's a luxury most people here don't realize we face every day. Speaking up shouldn't feel like stepping onto a ledge. Silence. Then applause. Not loud, but honest. By the end of the day, policy drafts had changed. Airline protocol documents had new language. But more importantly, so did the people who wrote them, because sometimes shadows on the tarmac aren't cast by planes, they're cast by the weight of what we carry aboard. The morning after the symposium, Ellis woke to a flurry of notifications. Her speech, barely recorded on someone's phone from the back row, had gone viral again. But this time, not just on news platforms. It had made its way into high schools, workplace training modules, and even TikTok edits. She scrolled past. One clip that paired her line, "The sky was never supposed to have a color-coded class system," with images of civil rights protests, airline seating maps, and archival footage of Rosa Parks. "Wow," she murmured. They really heard it. Derek was at a barber shop when it aired on a flat screen bolted to the wall. Around him, men nodded slowly. "That's his wife," said a barber named Q. Someone clapped Derek on the shoulder. "You proud?" He chuckled. "Every day." But not just because she spoke up, because she kept showing up, meanwhile. Margaret found herself walking alone through the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. She hadn't planned the visit. She just ended up there, needing to be anywhere else. She stopped before a massive painting of a storm-tossed sea. Waves, chaotic and fierce, crashing over a lone ship. For some reason, she saw herself in that vessel. Not the victim, but not the sea either. She was the wind, unseen, destructive. A tour group passed by, and she overheard the guide saying, "This painting represents accountability, the moment nature forces reckoning." Margaret stood still, listening. The airline released an internal memo, this time not meant for public display. It detailed new passenger conduct protocols, included bias training expansions, and highlighted a mandatory workshop titled Discomfort and Dialogue, Breaking the In-Flight Silence. Raymond was asked to help lead the session. "I'm not a trainer," he'd protested. "You are now," HR had replied. He stood at the front of a break room turned classroom, 30 flight attendants watching him, some skeptical, some curious, some quietly hopeful. "You don't have to be perfect," he began. "You just have to be present. And when someone's being dehumanized at 30,000 feet, silence is not neutral, it's compliance." A woman in the back clapped, then another, and another. Later that week, Ellis was approached by a publishing agent. They wanted her to write a memoir. She hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm ready to be an author." "You already are," the agent said. "You've authored a moment. Now finish the story." On Sunday, a church sermon in Atlanta quoted her. On Monday, a university dean requested her for a commencement speech. On Tuesday, her inbox held over 900 unread messages. Students, scholars, strangers who had seen themselves in her fight, not for the spotlight, but for the mirror. Because when the world is watching, the story isn't just told, it's multiplied. The airline offered Ellis and Derek a complimentary round-trip voucher to any destination in the world. It was framed as goodwill, a symbol of reconciliation and apology. Ellis turned it down. "We're not looking for perks," she told them. "We're looking for policies." But Derek, ever the practical one, suggested a compromise. "Let's take the trip, but we choose where, and we choose why." After some deliberation, they agreed. They booked 2 seats to Montgomery, Alabama, the birthplace of the civil rights movement. When the airline rep asked why, Ellis replied, "Because justice has roots." Margaret, meanwhile, stood at a different gate. No headlines, no crowds. Just her, a paperback novel, and a solo boarding pass to Seattle. She was visiting her sister, someone she hadn't seen in years. She carried a new travel bag. No designer tags. No monograms. It's just space. Simplicity. As she walked down the jet bridge, her chest tightened. Ah! Every sound, the hum of engines, the creak of the fuselage reminded her. She found her seat. Next to her sat a young black woman with a toddler on her lap. The woman smiled. "You mind if he kicks a little?" Margaret smiled back. "No, I don't mind at all." In Montgomery, Ellis and Derek visited the Legacy Museum. They walked silently through exhibits chronicling slavery, segregation, incarceration. They stopped before a wall covered in names, victims of racial terror. Derek said, "You think people see us differently now?" Ellis took his hand. "Maybe, but more importantly, maybe they see themselves differently." Later that evening, they walked through the city's Memorial Park. As the sun set, golden light washed over the bronze statues. One depicted a woman boarding a bus, posture tall, eyes forward. Ellis paused. "She reminds me of someone." Derek grinned. "Your mom?" Ellis nodded. "Maybe me." Back in L.A., Margaret joined her sister on a walk through the park. They didn't speak about what happened, not directly. But as they sat on a bench and watched children play, Margaret said, "I think I want to volunteer." Her sister raised an eyebrow. "At a food bank?" "No," Margaret said. "At a place where I have to listen, learn, help, maybe get uncomfortable?" Her sister smiled. "Now that's first class. Sometimes being rebooked doesn't just mean a different flight. It means a different destination, a different purpose, a different version of yourself." 3 months passed, the news cycle moved on. As it always does, but the ripples hadn't. Stopped. Ellis and Derek were back to work. She returned to teaching sociology at a local college. He resumed his architecture projects, designing affordable housing in underserved neighborhoods. Their lives had resumed normalcy, at least outwardly, but everything felt sharper now, more intentional. One afternoon, Ellis lectured on power, structures. A student raised his hand. "Do you ever wish it didn't happen?" Flight 328. She paused. "I wish the reason for it never existed, but the moment itself? No, because moments are mirrors." And this one made a lot of people finally look. Derek was on site for a new build when a delivery driver approached. "Hey man," he said awkwardly. "I know this is weird, but I recognized you from that plane video. My mom showed me." "Great." Derek smiled gently. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Margaret had joined a community circle in her neighborhood. Every Thursday night, they gathered in folding chairs at a rec center. They discussed race, bias, fear, and fragility. She didn't speak much at first, But one evening, she brought tea for the group. I figured the least I can do is keep the kettle hot while we do the harder work. People smiled. One woman, the same race as Ellis, nodded. Tea's a good. Start in the sky. New training videos played on flights across the country. Scenarios depicted not just safety instructions, but social scenarios, moments when kindness was tested at altitude. Raymond's voice narrated one clip. We rise together, or we fall divided. It's that simple. Ellis received a letter, handwritten, from a high schooler in Kansas. Dear Mrs. James, my teacher showed us your story. I didn't know standing up for something could start on a plane. I thought it had to be a protest. But now, I think it just has to be a choice. Ellis held the note close. There is something sacred about the space between people, invisible, powerful, and there is something powerful about choosing not to widen it. The sky between us isn't empty. It's full of stories a year had passed since flight 328. Ellis sat on a new flight. This one heading to New York. She had been invited to speak at a national education summit about equity in travel, teaching and the everyday spaces where people meet. She looked out the oval window, watching clouds drift like islands across a pale blue sea. Beside her sat a young white man in his 20s, hoodie zipped halfway, earbuds in. The flight attendant passed. He pulled one butt out. You headed to the city for business? Ellis smiled. A little of both. You ever get nervous flying? She shook her head. Not anymore. He grinned. I do. Every time, he didn't recognize her. Didn't mention the video. Just made space for conversation. And in that simplicity, something sacred happened. Margaret now worked part-time. At a public library, she helped with ESL classes, children's reading hours, and even joined a book club focused on authors of color. That week, the club read James Baldwin. I used to skip over the uncomfortable parts, she confessed. Now, I try to sit in them. An elderly man nodded. Growth ain't always graceful, but it's still growth. Derek hosted a small community design workshop in an old church basement. People came with ideas, bike lanes, murals, housing, solutions. He taught them how to sketch with purpose. Every space you create, he told them, affects someone else's dignity. So build like it matters. Raymond led a webinar on conflict resolution at 35,000 feet. He opened with a story about silence and the cost of it. On flight 328, he said, I realized that neutrality isn't safety, it's surrender. And I won't do that again. His voice didn't shake. Carried Ellis landed in New York. As she left the terminal, she passed a row of seats. One was empty. She stopped, sat down, closed her eyes for a moment, because the seat beside you isn't just space, it's possibility. It's where confrontation meets. Conversation, where silence can be shattered or shared. Ellis stood at the podium in a vast auditorium in Manhattan. Bright lights softened her silhouette as hundreds of educators, advocates, and students waited for her to speak. She looked down at her notes, then set them aside. I'm not here because of what happened to me. I'm here because of what it revealed. In all of us. She told the story of the flight not as a viral headline, but as a living moment, collision between comfort and courage. She spoke about dignity, about silence, about the difference between being polite and being just. I used to think progress was about big moments, she said. Now I know it's about small refusals. It's the decision not to look away, not to move your seat. The crowd rose, in applause, but more than that, they rose in reflection. Afterward, a black girl from the Bronx approached her. You said what I didn't know I needed to hear? Ellis hugged her. Then keep saying it to others and to yourself. Margaret wrote an op-ed, began. I was the woman in seat 14B. I was wrong. But I am not beyond reach. She didn't ask for redemption. She asked for accountability. It was published in The Atlantic. Some praised her, some criticized her, but all read it. Derek received an award for civic design. When asked what inspired his work, he simply replied, My wife fights for space in the sky. I try to build it here on the ground. Raymond was promoted to head trainer for new flight attendants. His first rule? No passenger is more important than another. Not ever. He taped that rule to the staff lounge wall in every major hub. The flight that changed everything didn't end when the wheels touched down. It just landed differently in people, in policy, in the promise of what flying could mean. Ellis. And Derek returned to LA and stopped at their favorite diner. As they ate, a waitress leaned over. My niece was on a flight last week. Someone tried to cause trouble. Another passenger shut it down, she said, Ellis James style. Ellis laughed. That's not a style, it's a stance. She looked at Derek, eyes full. We really flew through it, didn't we? He nodded, and we're still flying. Because sometimes the landing is just the beginning. Months later, far from headlines and hashtags, a little girl boarded her first flight with a backpack full of crayons and a heart full of questions. She sat beside her father, who pointed out the window and whispered, "You're flying now?" The girl looked at the empty seat across the aisle where a kind stranger smiled and offered her a juice box. No stares, no shifting away, just space shared without suspicion. Somewhere in the clouds above, where prejudice once sat unbuckled and loud, there now floated the quiet legacy of people who chose to stand, to listen, and to change, not for applause, but for one another. And in that sky, wide and watching, the world flew forward.